everyone, and welcome back to my YouTube channel and part 2 of my History of Rag Dolly. We're nearly there, guys. I say this because this is my 3rd video that I filmed today because I was like, oh my gosh, I have time and it's not sweltering. Let's try and get some content done for y'all. This is part 2 of my History of Rag Dolly. If you haven't seen part 1, there'll be a link in the description. There'll be a link in a card. If I remember to put it there, I will remember. Editing me, do not forget. Yeah, we're just gonna dive straight into it. Where we left off last time, can I summarize this in a quick way? Oh my god, my brain. TV special actually turns into a film, but Star Wars overshadows it. Joe Raposo joins the ESIPA. They're like, make it into a musical. First version doesn't go so great. They get William Gibson on. William Gibson and Joe Raposo, they have a bit of a creative difference, and they try and like sort it out, but they're like, oh, we'll just get on with it. Then they go into rehearsals. Then the OG Karen, Ellen Allen, complains about it, but they're like, it's fine, the kids seem to like it anyway. Let's do it again and then go to Moscow. We're now going to Moscow. But before we go to Moscow, we have some background to give to y'all, hence why this is video number 2, because otherwise things would be too long. Hope you caught up. Show of the week is still Rag Dolly because that's what we're talking about. So if you want another show, Google some stuff. But if you want to listen to Rag Dolly, it will be in the description. Hope you enjoy. Let's get into Moscow, the pre-Rag Dolly years. The reason we have some preliminary years for Moscow is because we've got to go back to when Patricia Snyder met a woman, a pioneer of children's theatre called Natalia Satz. I got the name right, yeah! Boom! I was like, it is Natalia, isn't it? It's not Natasha, it's not some other Russian name. No, it's Natalia with a Y. Boom. Banging. Yeah. I'm not cutting that, so just enjoy that moment. In 1972, Patricia Snyder meets Natalia Satz. Natalia Satz founded the first ever theatre for young audiences, and at the time, in 1972, when they both met, she was the director of the Moscow Children's Theatre. And Snyder and Satz met through the International Children's Theatre Association. So that was their connection, 2 women both passionate about theatre for young people. And in 1974, the 2 women had their first kind of exchange collaboration. Snyder directed a production of The Wizard of Oz, which then transferred to Moscow. And this exchange actually led to some new US legislation. I don't know if it was state level or federal level, because y'all with your states versus federal, it's confusing. Why not just have like one set of rules? I don't understand, but that's just me. Although having said that, like there's slightly different rules in like Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, so it's much of a muchness. Anyway, but as you've probably guessed by the fact that this is the 70s and we're talking about Moscow and the USA, it's the middle of the Cold War with the USSR and the US. So that kind of cultural exchange the 2 women started had to be put on a hiatus because of, you know, international relations. I'm not going to go into the Cold War because frankly I do not know enough about US-Russian relations. I know there was the Cuban Missile Crisis, and I know there was like McCarthyism, and I know what happened in chess. That's the extent of my knowledge. That's it, that's all I know. And the space race, everyone loves the space race. So yeah, that's the extent of my knowledge of the Cold War. If you want a video about the Cold War, look somewhere else, because I am not your girl. Sorry. However, the 2 women kept in contact, and in 1984, Snyder invited Satz to their first production of Raggedy Ann, aka Rag Dolly, aka Raggedy Ann, A Musical Adventure. So Satz came to see it and presumably liked it because in March of the following year, plans were starting to develop of potentially transferring the show to Moscow, just like they'd done with The Wizard of Oz. This wasn't truly possible until November of 1985, when the leaders of the US and the USSR signed a new cultural agreement to kind of backtrack on the refreezing of cultural exchange. But with that new agreement signed, it paved the way for rehearsals to start in Moscow in January of 1986. Whee! We love art bringing cultures together. For this production, which I didn't realize until again researching for this video, Ivy Austin actually learned the Russian translation of the song Rag Dolly and sang the whole song in Russian, which is pretty freaking cool. I mean, I don't know if she spoke any Russians beforehand, but I would imagine she didn't. So like, to learn a whole song in Russian, like, that's pretty freaking cool. And also, in the first preview of her singing that song in Russian, she got a 3-minute standing ovation, which is like, hey, you went through all that effort, get that standing ovation, girl, you deserve it. There were also a couple of bumps along the way. So for example, the score of Rag Dolly / Raggedy Ann had a lot of specific instruments which the Russian musicians didn't have access to. So those instruments had to be expressed from the US to the USSR. Don't even want to think about the customs fees, but hey, it had to happen. And also musically, there were a couple of moments that were lost in translation. In the band for the show, only 6 of the musicians were American, the rest of them were Russian. So they needed a translator to translate certain things. And whilst there are some kind of technical musical terms that are gonna be very standard, there was trouble with, for example, conveying what was meant by the sound of a mariachi band. Apparently Russia wasn't into their mariachi. The show itself wasn't actually widely advertised in Moscow, but it did end up selling out, mostly through word of mouth. I don't know how. I guess maybe people saw the first preview and were like, wow, let's do it. Everyone come, it's great. But yeah, it pretty much sold out just through word of mouth. So much so that tickets were being scalped at 10 times their original price. That's how much of a hot ticket Rag Dolly was in Moscow. Like, everyone was like, yeah, these Americans with their ragdoll, we're gonna come see. That was a terrible Russian accent. Why did you do that, Michaela? Why did you do that? This is what happens when you're tired and you're filming a video and you haven't filmed in such a long time and you do 3 back to back. This is what you get, guys. Are you not entertained? Despite all of the scalping and the translation issues and, I don't know, being in Russia in the winter, I mean, I imagine it's cold. I've never actually been to Moscow. I would imagine it would be cold in January. On January the 6th, 1986, Rag Dolly, as it was now being billed, opened in Moscow and ran for 2 previews and 8 performances. So a very, very short run. In terms of its reception, the Russians loved it. They thought it was great. In terms of the production, they added a few kind of Russian phrases and asides. So particularly Ivy Austin, as well as learning a whole song in Russian, which again, props to you, go queen. She would throw in the odd phrase in Russian, which they loved because they were like, hey, Russian words, we know what that means. Also, it was noted that most of the audience didn't really understand English, which led to some weird reactions of them laughing and clapping at odd times, or responding when they recognized certain words like Rolls Royce. But on the whole, they loved it. There was no criticism of the dark themes. Like, everyone was going crazy for it. So much so that a documentary was made about the whole cultural exchange, which I will also link in the description. The success of the show in Moscow kind of traveled around the world, especially seeing as you had the political frostiness? I guess it is the Cold War, the political frostiness of international relations between the USSR and the US. So it made news, like, we're kind of at war but not. We're having all of these proxy wars, you know, they're the communists over there, they're the capitalists over there, yet all of these artists can come together to make this beautiful show for kids. Everyone loved it. But then the road to Broadway began. I don't know why I said that like that. I guess I did, just go with it. So after all of that, how does this show get to Broadway? Well, first off, they need a Broadway producer, and they found one in the form of Roger L. Stevens. Roger L. Stevens was the founding chairman of the Kennedy Center for Performing Arts, and he had seen one of the performances of Rag Dolly at the ESIPA and agreed to produce it. One of his conditions was that he urged them to return to the original title, which had more brand recognition, which kind of makes sense. Rag Dolly isn't a thing, Raggedy Ann is. And that is one of the reasons why the musical goes by 2 names, because you had the Rag Dolly name and you have the Raggedy Ann, a musical adventure name, but they're all the same musical. It's all to do with branding, guys. Gotta love it. So before their Broadway transfer, they had a 1-month tryout at the Kennedy Center from the 23rd of August to the 21st of September 1986. And the title that they settled on for this run and the Broadway one was Raggedy Ann, The Musical Adventure. Because it's a musical and it's an adventure. Don't even worry about it. Although the show was relatively well received at the Kennedy Center, critics did question why the Kennedy Center was producing Raggedy Ann, The Musical Adventure, to which the response was, the show took Moscow by storm, which it did, but also I feel like that's slightly disingenuous, but we'll get to it. After its tryout, Raggedy Ann then transferred to the Nederlander Theatre, opening for previews on the 3rd of October. It then had its press night on the 16th of October before closing abruptly on the 19th of October. In total, it ran for 15 previews and 5 performances, which is not a very long run at all. So what was the reception of the show? In my previous video, we've heard that it had a good reception at the ESIPA. In this video, we've heard that it had a good reception in Moscow, a great reception, in fact, a sellout run. At the Kennedy Center, even though there was some critique and hesitation about the dark themes, especially in a family-aimed show, it also had fairly good reviews. One of the reviewers, David Richards from the Washington Post, said, quote, "For all the echoes of past shows, Raggedy Ann is potentially original." He also praised the score. He did critique the character of Marcella, calling her, quote, "peevish, whiny, and ungrateful." I mean, kinda yeah. But on the whole, it was a positive review. However, the Broadway reviews were mostly negative. There were some exceptions, which I will get to in a second, but here are just some of the things that some of the critics said when it opened on Broadway. One of the reviewers said, "Any little girl who prizes her own Raggedy Ann doll can probably tell better stories about it than this disjointed and distasteful musical." Another reviewer said, "An uncurable case of the cutes coupled with an unnerving rush of boredom." Another reviewer, "The author apparently considers it beneath him to wrap his highfalutin message in a coherent, let alone exciting story." So those are some of the contemporaneous critiques of the show. And then a critique in hindsight in his book, Not Since Carrie, 40 Years of Musical Flops, writer Ken Mendelbaum says of the show, quote, "Too grim and humorless for children and offered too little to entertain adults." This backlash to the show came as quite a shock to the cast and creative team, with Ivy Austin saying, quote, "I cannot remember an audience that I felt rejected the show. The reviews on opening night were shocking to us all." They weren't expecting it. Now, like I said, there were some positive reviews. A lot of the positive reviews praised the performances and the music, with one reviewer saying, quote, "Bright, tuneful, funny, and such wonderful nonsense that I would have happily sat through it again." But with the amount of negative reviews that there were, Rag Dolly couldn't survive. In terms of its performance history in a professional setting, that was the end of Rag Dolly. So what are my final thoughts? To start off with this, I want to quote one more quote from one of the reviews of the show from the Kennedy run, and it says, quote, "Assuming its creators can iron things out, they've got a rarity on their hands." And I think that quote kind of sums up what happened with Rag Dolly. I think, and again, I said this in my review of Rag Dolly, I think that there are some things in that show, in that script, in that book that need ironing out. And if those things are ironed out, it would be an amazing Broadway show. I think a lot of the history of the show has quite a lot to do with that. I think if there wasn't that mad dash to get a new production up before they lost the rights, they could have had more time to get a writer and composer lyricist pairing that really worked well together and inspired each other to create the best show possible. And I think not only the rush to stage, but also the rush to Broadway prevented that ironing out process from being done. Obviously there are gaps in the story. There's a gap between the first production at the ESIPA and the second one before Moscow. There's a gap between Moscow and Broadway. I don't know if any work was done to the show significant work was done to the show in those two gaps. I would imagine the gap between ESIPA 1 and 2, obviously we know that there was some moving arounds of songs and additions of songs, but I imagine most of that was taken up with trying to get Moscow to happen. In terms of post-Moscow to Broadway, I imagine that there was a lot of technical ironing out the nuts and bolts of how that transfer was work, raising capital, things like that. And I wonder if any thought would have been made to, we need to work on this show to get it as good as it can be, and if we have the money to spare to put money in that direction, or if we need to just raise as much capital as possible to pay to hire the venue and pay for bigger sets and all of that stuff. I don't know, I wasn't there, but it seems like too little time in those two gaps to have really done the work that it needed to do. I also wonder if the ambition of the creative team, particularly Raposo, although I doubt he was alone in this, and the huge success that the show had for its intended audience also blinded the cast and creative team from essentially seeing the wood for the trees, for seeing their show objectively and being like, is this a show for a Broadway audience? Which is understandable. I mean, if you're playing to audiences who love it, even audiences who love it when they're watching it not in their first language, of course you're going to be like, we have an amazing show. And they did have an amazing show. They do have an amazing show. Like I said in my review, it doesn't mean it's a Broadway show. And I feel like their success with the family audience it was intended for blinded them to the show's flaws when you're looking at a Broadway transfer. And the final nail in the coffin for it as a Broadway show was that it was hit by critics who weren't reviewing the show for what it was. This is the big issue that I have with theatre criticism, is that oftentimes you can have curmudgeonly reviewers, they're not all curmudgeonly, but for example, curmudgeonly reviewers who have a very set idea of what theatre should be. And when there's theatre that is made for a different audience or in a different style or for a different demographic or whatever, they don't review what that show was made for. They review that show based on what they think theatre should be. This was a show written for families. It's not going to be the same as some prestige theatre piece, right? It's just not. It's made for families, it's made for children to enjoy. It's unfair to treat it like it's not that, in my opinion. I think this also hammers home that a good show and a Broadway show are not synonymous. I can't speak for Broadway because I've never seen a show on Broadway, because I've only been to New York once and it was for 3 days. And yeah, Broadway show was not on the agenda, but I can speak from the point of view of the West End. There's stuff in the West End that I don't think is good. There's stuff that's not on the West End that I've seen that I've thought is amazing. Good and West End / Broadway are not synonyms, and I think that's something that as a theatre community we need to remember. Broadway, the West End, isn't necessarily the be all and end all, because a lot of that success is down to commercial viability. All sorts of things can affect how successful a show is in somewhere like the West End or Broadway. So yeah, we shouldn't see those things as synonymous, and we shouldn't see a Broadway shop and we shouldn't see a Broadway flop as meaning that a show is inherently bad. What it's really about is finding your audience. When Rag Dolly was in front of its audience, it did amazingly well and people loved it. And the same with one of the positive reviews it got. Bright, tuneful, funny, and such wonderful nonsense that I would have happily sat through it again. That was a reviewer that got Rag Dolly. That person got what it was about and was like, yes, I would sit through this again. I get it. I'm here, I'm with you. When you find the audience that is with you and gets what you're getting at, that's when you have success, and that's when you touch people and move people. With the Rare movement, there are loads of people who have discovered this musical and have had the same reaction. Yes, I get this. It's whimsy, it's nonsense, it's dark and it's deep and it's bright and it's colourful, and I love it. And that's the hallmark of a successful show, of a good show, is when it finds its audience, if it has an audience. That's the big takeaway, is like, make sure you have an audience, but when you have that audience and you find them and you bring them in and like, hey, this is for you, that's when you have a good show. That's when you have a great show. That's when you have theatre that does what theatre does, which is get people in a room and share an experience. So yeah, those are my final thoughts. Let's do the outro, because I feel like I ended on a good note. So that is the end of my Rag Dolly mini-series, I guess. I hope you've enjoyed. People who have been asking for Rag Dolly content, I hope I haven't disappointed. I hope that you've enjoyed my take on it, and I hope that Rag Dolly gets another life for y'all. I mean, does it even have rights? I'm sure you can get the rights for it. If you know an amateur dramatic society or a youth group that wants a musical to do, suggest Rag Dolly. I think it would be great. Get people knowing about this musical and loving this musical, because it clearly has an audience out there who would love it. And if you're one of those people who love the whimsical nonsense, then have at it. Go and enjoy. And I might listen to it tonight, actually. I'll see how I feel. I might try and edit, or I was meant to do some writing today. It's been a long day, y'all, but I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, then please consider liking and subscribing. We'd love to have you on the channel. Come on down. We have a great time filming videos when we're very, very tired. Stay tuned for more theatre content from a UK perspective, and I will see you all in my next video. Bye, friends!